We are ready to begin with the second seminar of the 49th Board of Governors meeting. From vulnerability to resilience, you choose. Okay, could I ask if you please take your seats? We are ready to begin. Okay, I think we can begin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second seminar of the 49th annual meeting of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank. My name is Justin Ram, and I'm the Director of Economics. We just heard a very wonderful discussion around agriculture at the regional level, but now it's time for us to come back to this, unfortunately, all too familiar issue of building resilience in our countries. And that comes about because we have found ourselves to be quite vulnerable. As you know, in 2017, many of our board member countries were struck by the catastrophic hurricanes that came through the Caribbean during the hurricane season of 2017. Dominica, unfortunately, lost about 225% of GDP. And I should say that less than 2 years before that, Dominica was struck by Storm Erika and lost close to 100% of GDP. Now, there's been a lot of discussion since then about how do we go about building resilience in our countries. Now, we all know in the development community that what gets measured is what we focus on. And so, in looking at this particular issue, we at the Caribbean Development Bank decided in 2018 to begin to try to measure how vulnerable our economies are. And we have recognized that vulnerability is not only environmental. We have found that our economies are also highly vulnerable to economic shocks, but that we also have social vulnerabilities. And so today, with this panel discussion, we will also be presenting the findings of our new publication that's going to be published at, I understand, 4:20 this afternoon, on a new multidimensional vulnerability index for the Caribbean. But before we get to that presentation, I want to introduce to you the panelists who are going to be discussing this issue. How do we move from vulnerable to resilient? To moderate this panel, I have the great pleasure in introducing the governor of the 49th meeting of the Board of Governors, someone who I'm sure you're all very familiar with now, the Honorable Minister Camille Robinson-Regis. Minister, please come forward. Thank you. To discuss this important topic, I am extremely pleased to welcome someone who I consider to be, well, I hope I can say my good friend, someone who I consider to be a great visionary within the Caribbean. He thinks long term. He has a great vision for his country. But more importantly, I think he has a wonderful vision for our region. Please welcome Honorable Prime Minister Alan Chastanet. I also want to welcome someone who I think is so articulate and versed in all things developmental, but certainly on the topic of building resilience. And coming from that country that I spoke about earlier, Dominica, she is well placed to speak on how we need to go about building back better. Please welcome to the podium the Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs, the Honorable Minister Francis Barron from Dominica. Our last panelist, I think for us at CDB, whenever we meet with her, she brings great pride to us. She is one of the, I think, bright sparks in political landscape that we now have in the Caribbean. She is certainly going to be one of our aspiring and wonderful leaders. And I think it's going to be well into the future. She has a very strong intellect and can speak on many topics from governance. And I know that this particular topic of building resilience is close to her heart, particularly as it relates to social resilience. Please welcome to the stage the Honorable Marsha Cadell, Minister of Economic Affairs for Barbados. But before we begin the discussion, we want to give you a presentation on the results of our new multidimensional vulnerability index. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my lions of the economics department at the Caribbean Development Bank, a formidable economist. And in fact, I'm sure that one day he should become director of the department sometime. I'm putting it out there to you, putting it out into the universe for you. Please welcome Mr. Jason Cotton to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished panelists and colleagues, today my task is relatively simple. I will share with you some of the highlights from the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. Just as soon as my technology begins to work. Oh, great. So the agenda is relatively simple. We'll speak very briefly about the development challenges, the objectives of the study, the methodology, and the results and conclusions. All right, I will take a signal from last night. You were there last night. Every time I do this, great. So, colleagues, what we have here is in these 4 quadrants, we've highlighted the development challenges, or some of them, in our region. And as Dr. Ram said, what is immediately very evident is that the challenges that confront us are not just macroeconomic. It's not just about low growth and high debt and the loss of correspondent banking relationships, but they're human development challenges. High levels of poverty and inequality, particularly among the youth. High levels of crime and citizen insecurity. Their productivity and competitiveness challenges. President Smith spoke about the challenges in terms of the ease of doing business, as well as we know about the high energy and electricity costs. And the environmental challenges are well known to us. But underlying all of these sectoral challenges, there are also challenges with respect to implementation of the plans and policies that we have, and the absence of regional approaches to address these challenges. So in 2018, the Caribbean Development Bank Economics Department did a working paper entitled A Blueprint for Resilient Caribbean Economies. And what we highlighted in this blueprint was in each of these 4 quadrants, we highlighted action points to help to build resilience in our economies, or actions that we believe would help to build resilience towards sustainable societies. And as a society that you and I want to work and live in and grow up our family. And undergirding those action points are some key cross-cutting themes. There must be regional approaches and coordination. We need to ensure that there's gender equality. We need to ensure that we leverage digital technology in improving efficiency and effectiveness. We need to improve our statistics, and we need to pursue the implementation of our policies. So the objective of this index was to quantify in our borrowing member countries their relative vulnerability to external shocks. And this is important because back in 2014, the United Nations had the 3rd International Conference of small island developing states. And in that conference, the whole idea of quantifying vulnerability came back to international prominence. In addition to that, for us at the CDB, quantifying vulnerability is also important because in our allocation formula for concessional resources, there is a vulnerability component. And thirdly, for us as well, we want to ensure that when we speak to our borrowing member countries, we're speaking from a position of evidence. We want to speak to them from a position of data. And as a result, the vulnerability index helps us in speaking in that way. So this is not the first time that the economics department is doing research like this. We previously computed an economic vulnerability index. What we are pursuing now is a multidimensional vulnerability index. So what's different is that we've included a social dimension. To the environmental dimension, what we've done is in the previous index, we just looked at the impact of natural hazards to vulnerability. We've extended that to include how climate change as well impacts vulnerability, and how climate change affects vulnerability now, but also into the future. And we updated the index for the years 2016 and 2017. And we used 3 basic criteria to guide the design of the index. Firstly, it must be simple. It must be easy for everyone here to understand. So if at the end of this you don't understand it, then there's an indictment on me. The second criteria is it must be comprehensive. It must cover all of the key areas. And the third basic criteria is it must be comparable. It must use data that we can gather for as many countries as possible. In this slide, what we do is we get into the methodology of the index. So there are 3 dimensions: an economic, a social, and an environmental dimension. And supporting those dimensions, we've identified what we believe to be the causes of vulnerability. So for example, in the economic, if a country is reliant on a few major export partners, of course, if there's a shock in any of those partners, that is transferred to the country. If a country has a few major exports and something happens to one of those major export sectors, again, it constrains that country's foreign exchange reserves, earnings. In terms of the dependence on strategic imports, we heard in the last panel about the necessary to grow your own food, and if there's some kind of shock, the kind of challenge that could cause for the economy. And the dependence on foreign capital to achieve development objectives. So all of these are the causes of vulnerability within the economic dimension. In the social dimension, what we are trying to capture is the country's ability to cope with some exogenous shock. And in the natural hazards and climate change dimension, we were looking at how susceptible the country is to natural hazards and climate change. And I should say, colleagues, that it is that framework, as Dr. Ram mentioned, that guided the design of our multidimensional vulnerability index. It is this view that vulnerability is beyond economic, but vulnerability also includes social and environmental that guided how we designed our index. Here what you see is the vulnerability index scores for the years 2016 and 2017. And I should say that countries closer to 0 are countries with lower vulnerability, while countries with scores closer to 1 are countries with higher vulnerability. And what we observed when we looked at this chart is, firstly, if you look across the countries, it's apparent that the tourism-based economies seem to have higher vulnerabilities than the commodity-based economies. And why is that so? Well, one particular reason is that the commodity-based economies are net exporters of fuel. And as a result, in that subcomponent of the index, they would have a very low score. And as well, if you look at the commodity-based economies that are there, Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, if you look at the historic impact of natural disasters on those economies, the level of impact of disasters on those economies relative compared to the others were relatively low. Now, we know that with the impact of climate change, things could change. But based on the historic data, this is what it showed us. The notable outlier there is Montserrat. And in Montserrat, what we observed is that, remember, this index is calculated at a point in time, and the data is relative to all of the other countries. And in Montserrat, what we observed is that the level of export concentration relative to the other countries was lower, as well as the susceptibility to natural disasters, the extent or the repeatedness with which there were natural disasters in Montserrat was also lower than some of the other countries. What's also important in this graphic is that it shows us the vulnerability score in 2 years, in 2016 and 2017. And if we look at two countries, for example, Dominica and let's say Antigua, we would notice that in 2016, the scores were about 0.49. And in 2017, the scores increased to 0.54. So the question is, what is driving that increase in vulnerability? If we look at the Cayman Islands as a converse example, we would see that in 2017, the vulnerability index score was 0.48, while in 2016, it was 0.50. So what it meant is that vulnerability actually declined. And so the question is, what's driving that? Next slide. So this very colorful chart here pretty much gives us a deeper dive into the vulnerability of our borrowing member countries. And the colors really represent the vulnerability index scores from low in green to high in red. And just by looking at this chart very quickly, what jumps out to us is that the majority of our borrowing member countries are in the medium to high category. And if we delve a little deeper, we see that, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, there's an overall low vulnerability score. But when you look at the social dimension, you see that there are challenges in terms of social vulnerability. If we, again, look at, and I should say in Trinidad and Tobago, we see zeros there in terms of the environment. That does not mean that Trinidad and Tobago has no environmental vulnerability. But remember, it's a relative ranking. So what's happening is that the country that has the lowest data in that particular category is assigned a score of 0, while the country that has the highest data is assigned a score of 1. So 0 just means there that in terms of relative to the other countries, what happened in terms of the environmental component was lower than the other countries. And it does not mean that there's no environmental vulnerability. Very quickly to go to Haiti, because my time is almost upon me. When we look at Haiti, we see a different picture. We see a more pervasive view of vulnerability throughout all of the dimensions. And so what that means is that there must be a more cohesive approach in terms of addressing these vulnerabilities. Next slide. As I seek to wrap up, colleagues, this seems like a very busy slide, but what we've done is we've moved beyond the causes of vulnerability into the proxy indicators. And the proxy indicators give us a deeper dive so that we begin to understand what is driving this vulnerability in the country. So for example, in Barbados, you have a low overall score of 0.48. But if you look at strategic imports, and F stands for food and E is for energy, you would see that Barbados still has a relatively high dependence on imported hydrocarbons with a relatively high vulnerability score. So the takeaway from this is that we can take a deeper dive to see where exactly the constraints are and try to diagnose policies to address this. So colleagues, to conclude, there are 3 major takeaways from my presentation. The first is that when we look at our borrowing member countries, they are middle to high vulnerability countries. And these vulnerabilities are concentrated in the areas of dependence on strategic imports, export concentration, and exposure to natural hazards. The second takeaway is that we believe that this multidimensional vulnerability index can support evidence-based policy formulation, not only for us at the CDB when we speak to our borrowing member countries, but we believe that borrowing member countries may find some utility in it as well, as it could assist in terms of the determining or justifying some of their development priorities. And the third takeaway is that we believe that there's a potential role in CDB's financial resource allocation framework for the use of this multidimensional vulnerability index. And consideration is being given as to how it can be used to improve the allocation of financial resources. I thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ram, for the introductions, and thank you, Mr. Cotton. I am very pleased to be moderating this seminar, and I would like to start very early by saying that the islands of the Caribbean share very unique and particular vulnerabilities, which result in a complex set of challenges, and that is made clear by the information that you have revealed. It is clear that the main challenges of our economies include the impacts of climate change, lack of productivity, poor infrastructure, lack of use of modern technology, which could, if all synergies come together, result in an improved economies for all of us in the region. And so there's a sort of a complexity and a magnitude of issues that we must deal with if we have to move from vulnerability to resilience and to transformation. And I would like to start by asking a question, jumping right into a question to all the panelists. And I'd ask if, because of seniority, that the Prime Minister of St. Lucia will answer first. Prime Minister, as a region, what are the most critical changes that we must make for our economies and societies to thrive in the next 20 to 30 years? It's a broad question, but I think if we start off broad, then we can narrow into some specifics. So, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm not so sure I like the criteria. As being the most senior person, I mean, some very capable people to my left. For me, it's a couple of words. It's first of all, potential. I just don't think that we focus enough on what our potential is. And so if we live in a realm of that we want to grow by X percentage per year, that may not be enough. In fact, we know it's not enough. Who's actually calculated what our potential is as a region? I use the example here in Trinidad. An engineer can determine how much oil there is in the ground. Another engineer can come and determine what's the cost of extracting that oil. An economist can come and run a model to tell you over a period of time, here's how much you're going to earn off of the total resources that you've estimated to have. And so a Minister of Finance or Economic Development can make a decision on the basis, okay, here's what my full potential of this sector is, here's how much money I can be able to have to invest, and here's how much I can earn over a period of time. Who's done that for tourism? Who's done that for trade? Who's done that for innovation? Can anybody put a number on what's the capacity of this country, the potential of this country with regards to innovation? Now, once we start understanding and getting into the realm of potential, the next thing becomes about capacity. So in the case of St. Lucia, we've said, okay, where's our potential? And if I had to do a quick calculation, Barbados's GDP is 5 billion. Bahamas's GDP is 12 billion, but of that 12 billion, 8 billion is Nassau, and 4 billion is Paradise Island. Aruba is a GDP of $3.5 billion. St. Lucia is 1.7. I have a population of 170,000, you have a population of 270,000. The Bahamas has a population of 370,000. So can I say, well, given where their performance is at minimum, St. Lucia's GDP should be $5 to $6 billion. Now, if I all of a sudden say that that's in the realm of my feasibility, the question becomes, what's the capacity to be able to get to that number? So if St. Lucia was to double or triple its GDP over the next 10 years, what would be the constraints to growth? I can clearly look at my airport's too small, I don't have enough roads, I'm not producing enough water, my government infrastructure can't cope with more requests, my output is too high. So all of a sudden, that becomes a problem. The next question I must ask myself, okay, is what are the industries that would allow me to grow by 300 or 400%? So if it's going to be agriculture, the panel was on here before, unless you're going to get into extremely high value products, we don't have enough physical size and we don't have enough economies of scale to be able to be competitive. So the sectors that you're thinking of is tourism, financial services, your retirement market, and you can measure what those things are going to be. So I'm saying that that's important because now you understand what resources you're going to require to be able to grow. Another critical number that we do in St. Lucia is to say, okay, what's the most important economic input that we're going to have? So if I reach my full potential, meaning that I reach full employment in St. Lucia, do I have the capacity to bring in more labor? The answer is, of course. If I run out of money in my banks and I still have projects that are producing a competitive rate of return, are there more resources outside of St. Lucia that are available? The answer is, of course. But if I run out of land, can I produce more land? And I can't. So it means that my output per acre becomes the measurement I must use in order to reach my full potential. So I just want to say that, you know, for me, that's what we need to come to terms of what our potential is, relate it back to capacity, and then understand what the constraints to growth there are relative to the competitiveness on a global basis.
Thank you very much. Perhaps what you should do, though, is have an engineer as a Minister of Finance.
Please, no, please.
Could be. We'd probably be better off.
Minister Barron,
Yes.
your opening salvo.
I think that one of the critical challenges that we face as a region is how do we respond to the effects of climate change and the natural effect that has on our ability to be economically resilient and to be able to be profitable. And so we have to look at building resilience as a region. We have taken the decision as CARICOM that we will become a resilient region. And there are practical things that we must do in order to build that resilience. And we have to look at resilience not just from the point of having infrastructure that is more resilient, but we have to look at building resilience in our social sectors, in our economic sectors, in our environmental sectors as well. And part of that building resilience will require a transformation of how we do things. We have to do things differently. We have to find ways of engaging our youth, getting them involved in the productive sector. We had a very good discussion a while ago in relation to the area of agriculture. And that forms part of the whole product of building resilience generally. We have to look at practical ways in which we can inculcate resilience into everything that we do. For us in Dominica, I think Hurricane Maria was a very poignant reminder of how vulnerable we are, not just Dominica, but as a region, because we had Maria, we had Irma, we had the different storms in the region. And we have taken the decision to build resilience, but to have, not just talk about it, but to look at practical ways in which we can become resilient. So we developed a national resilience strategy for Dominica, and we're now moving into a national resilience and recovery plan for Dominica that will have concrete targets. We're identifying what the challenges are, how those challenges can be addressed with a view to building resilience in all of these sectors. And we've also created a climate resilience execution agency for Dominica, which is tasked with developing on that plan and delivering on that plan. And I think we have to look at ways in which we can get the support of our institutions, such as the CDB, the World Bank, our donor partners, to work with us to have concrete ways in which we can address the need to build resilience in our different sectors. I think that's the only way that we will be able to survive and prosper, because we must address in a practical way the challenges that we face, the vulnerabilities that we face as a region.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of Barbados, they have been walking a particular road in terms of determining practical ways to deal with issues. So, Minister Cadell, if you could address the issue.
Thank you. I think, first of all, when I saw the topic, I was a bit alarmed, because the topic from vulnerability to resilience, you choose, suggests a choice in being vulnerable. And I think that one of the things that we have to first understand and realize is that we have a certain level of vulnerability and exposure. And that is given. If you are located in a hurricane belt, if you are a small economy that is being pushed globally in the direction of being open in certain markets, there is a certain level of vulnerability. What we do from there is, as the bank has started to do, is understand what that vulnerability looks like, understand what it means, and then decide from there then what resilience can mean and look like. So I think the notion that we are somehow going to be able to move away from the vulnerability discussion is a false choice. That being said, I was sitting here reflecting on the components of the index. I know that this is an area of work that we've been looking at for some time. And I do think that there are some considerations that may be missing, or that could help contribute. One of the things that is important for the region and for each country to look at is, what is your capacity to capitalize on the inputs that are necessary to growth and prosperity? What are those inputs? For us in particular, I mean, we in Barbados, and I would dare say in the region, our model is one of expanding choice. So our model is one of development. How do we do that? One of the key areas is education. And using education and capitalizing on that resource in order to contribute to the kind of growth that we want to see. So if, for example, I were to consider, what is it about the education system or the approach to education in Barbados that makes it vulnerable? Are we, in fact, investing in education in such a way that people can be a key part of our growth and prosperity? Are we investing in health in such a way that people and their wellness and their productivity can be a key part of our growth and prosperity? So for us, that's what a new development and a new resilience model looks like. It is very inextricably linked to the issues of climate and environment. And as the index that Jason presented does, it shows that they're not pillars because pillars stand alone, but they're a very integrated part of the question of resilience. So I think that overall, we need to understand that whether we're responding to climate change or whether we're looking at how is a country able to adapt technology, how is a country able to invest in the things that contribute to its growth, those are perhaps the parts of vulnerability that you want to think about. When you look at a country, what is its capacity to really invest and to capitalize on people? And that might be a good thing to consider in terms of performance and how countries are doing when you look at the question of vulnerability. I think that for us, and you mentioned what are some of the practical things that we've been doing and looking at. One of the things that we've realized in the whole discussion on climate change is that there has been a focus on adaptation and mitigation, and of course, in solidarity, the countries of the region, small as we are, we do contribute to adaptation and mitigation measures, but we are not the ones who are creating the problem from which we're suffering. And so more and more, we have to have the courage, I think, to look at models that go beyond, for example, the CRIF, where we are purchasing our own insurance, and to look at how do we go back to the polluter pays model. How do we get the countries that are contributing to invest in instruments like CRIF, so that those, when we suffer or when we experience a disaster, that there's a global understanding and a global recognition that this comes from those countries that contribute to global warming and that are having the greatest impact on climate change. So I think that there are a series of things to consider when we look at how we're building resilience, and understanding that really we need to move to climate proofing our economies. And in fact, it's important, I think, that this conversation takes place alongside the one on digital transformation, because our economies are extremely susceptible. So we're not just talking about physical infrastructure, but the industries in which most of our people are involved. And the more we move away from being determined by our physical location and being determined by our digital location and our digital positioning in a new economy, I think that gets us closer to the question of resilience.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that each of you have mentioned some keywords: potential, capacity, mechanisms to get things done, and it draws us into the conversation of institutional strengthening. And I would like to ask you to think about the issue of whether the region has been developing those critical institutions which would lead us to a position of strength, and a position where we can determine that we have made that quantum leap to move us to that next direction of not just developing countries, but countries that are really on a development trajectory. And so I want to ask, what is each government doing to reduce its vulnerability and to improve its resilience in such a way as to mitigate against the exogenous shocks and also the climate issues?
I think that the greatest risk that we have, and look, all our vulnerabilities are there. And before this climate change issue, they were there. So whether we're vulnerable from economic shocks, that's global. Everybody has that, and you have to learn to compete in the world. So to me, the biggest issue, what are the things that are facing us that we don't have the power to solve? So if you look at climate change, and we talked about mitigation and adaptation, so the developed world is on the mitigation, right? So we had COP in France, and we're going to agree to no more than 1.5 degrees of increasing in heat. And that's not happened, right? Now, the SIDS, the small island developing states, 39 of us, are only 1/2% of the world emissions. Mm-hmm. So it means if we adopt all the best practices in mitigation, can't control my own destiny. I have to depend on the developed world to adhere to the rules that they've imposed on themselves, that now there's mixed feelings as to whether those are real or not. So it means I have to take into consideration, unfortunately, that I can't wait for the hurricane to hit. Mm-hmm. I have to have preventive medicine, which means I must physically build the resilience, the infrastructural resilience, because that's the biggest challenge we have. Okay, it's physical resilience. So the loss in Dominica, it's physical, right? So you can talk about social, and you can talk about all the other things which are important, but the one that is confronting us right now that we don't control is that we don't have a light switch to God to tell him, please don't send a hurricane this year, right? That there is statistically, it's increasing the chances that we're going to be affected by a natural disaster. And that these natural disasters are getting stronger, and we clearly know that they come with a lot of rain. In the case of last time, Dominica, some very ferocious winds. And therefore, our physical infrastructure is in jeopardy. But we know that generally we can build physical resilience to mitigate against the total amount of damage, so that the amount of money we need to reinvest to get going again is not going to be as much. And that's within our financial constraints to be able to make it happen. But now we have man-made rules by the development agencies, OECD, World Bank, IMF, that said that we have to have a per capita GDP of no more than 60%. And how much money we can borrow, and all these different rules. And then because of governance issues, we're also concerned about all these things, that we've allowed the governance issues to dominate what we're actually trying to achieve in the first place. So the governance issues we have in place are not sensitive to the fact that a hurricane happens every year. So it means that when we have the emergency after the fact, everybody's willing to give you immediate emergency money to clean up, but there isn't the money to build the resilience back. So we use, or the world has been using a term now, the new normal. And I really believe we're just saying it. We don't genuinely understand what the new normal is. But I'll tell you what I think it is. The new normal is that if I take over the next 15 years and I do not build any physical resilience, that more than likely I will be hit by a hurricane, and my debt to GDP will more than likely go past 100%. Will increase by 50, 60, 70% easily. So the question is, if I know that, what can I do to prevent that from happening? So I need to spend money. Where is that money going to come from? How are we going to classify that money? So we've said, one, the OECD needs to allow middle-income countries to be reclassified not on per capita GDP, but on a vulnerability index. So I'm happy to see that we're in the process of building one for the Caribbean. Secondly, that we need a dedicated fund. We can't wait for COP, right? There are ODA funds already in existence. The SIDS, who are not in control of our own destiny, require a source of monies ASAP, and that the protocol to draw down on those monies needs to be changed, reflective of the fact that the hurricanes are taking place every year. And then finally, we need to be able to determine how we're going to classify the debt, because this is an expenditure that is out of my control. This is not me creating. It's not a result of an action of ours that we're getting this exposure. And we need help to be able to resolve it. Now, everything else, vulnerability that we have, will be to naught if we don't fix this. Because this has the potential of making us failed states. And I just don't get the sense that we're moving with the level of urgency. When we had the meeting in Washington, D.C. in November, at the end of the conversation, the room was silent, because I think all the technical people would have agreed with the assessment I've just said, but nobody knows how to fix it. CDB doesn't know how to address the ODAs to say, can we change our governance structure that we can implement these projects quicker? And these are engineering. This is what? Slope stabilization, putting utility wires underground, building bigger drains, fixing up the rivers, okay? And the last one, which we're not even taking into consideration, which is the greatest threat, is the rising seawater levels. So if in fact we get climate change of increase of more than 1.5%, we're talking 3 feet, right? 80% of the Bahamas is gone. There are models that we've all done to show what's going to happen to our country. So it means that in addition to the things we can physically see, we now have to start building resilience to what we cannot see. And so therefore, if areas are going to flood, what are the things you can currently do to be able to resolve that problem? So when we come back, I can finish in terms of what I think some of the solutions are, but I would just say to you that, honestly, biggest challenge that we have as countries right now in terms of our own viability is this issue on resilience. And it's about how we're going to access the funding to do it, how we're going to satisfy the governance structures, and how we're going to classify the debt. Because if, in fact, you don't deal with those things, then what we gain in physical resilience, we're going to lose in economic resilience, which means the other things like healthcare, education, and social will now be negated, and we're actually going to fall prey to those things.
I think, Madam Moderator, that Prime Minister Chastanet has outlined very well what the challenges that we face in being able to respond to the issue of building resilience. I always like to quote this study by ECLAC that speaks to the high debt in the region. And one of the things that they have said is that 40% of the debt of the region is as a result of having to respond to disasters. And that is the reality. You take a loan, you build infrastructure, a hurricane comes, destroys it, you're still paying back for that loan, and you have to get another loan to rebuild that infrastructure. And that is the reality that we face. So it is a challenge for governments to be able to build the resilience that's necessary. And let's look at it from a practical point of view. The Hurricane Maria in Dominica caused damage to 90% of the housing stock in different degrees. Some were destroyed completely, some were destroyed in different degrees. One has to build back and build back better. But to build back better requires you to expend a lot more in finances. So even though those persons who had insurance, their insurance, you never get the full amount from insurance to begin with. And secondly, to build back better, it costs you more. And therefore, you have to find those additional funds to be able to rebuild your home, being able to resist a Category 5 hurricane. That comes with a significant cost. We have communities that are located in very vulnerable areas. So government has embarked on a program, an ambitious program to build 5,000 homes. Of course, we have to build it in a resilient manner. So we're looking at building communities where you have the undergrounding of your utilities. You build with concrete roofs so that protects it from roofs being blown off in a hurricane. But that is a very expensive venture. The access to affordable financing on a timely basis is of critical importance. We have thankfully been able to do some front loading of the expenses to begin our housing revolution based on funds that we had from the Citizenship by Investment program. So that enabled us to begin almost immediately. Where funding has been promised from international donor partners and agencies, that funding takes too long for us to be able to draw down on it. And time is not on our side. We are again in another hurricane season, and we pray God that we are not hit again. But we have people who are in vulnerable circumstances, and therefore we need to act now. We cannot wait for 3, 4, 5 years to begin dealing with issues such as ensuring that people are in homes that are safe from hurricane. And so you have to expend significant resources in looking at building resilience, reducing your vulnerabilities. We have in Dominica a number of rivers, many, many rivers, and that creates a great flooding risk. We have spent millions of dollars since Hurricane Maria in dredging rivers to ensure that if the rains come, we don't have villages washed away by flooding. All of those things cost a lot of money. They do not yield any economic activity except for the persons doing the actual dredging, but it's something that must be done by the government. So whereas there are steps that governments can take, we're constrained as to how quickly we can move because the access to financing is not there. It is critical for there to be a resilience fund that is established to assist our countries in the Caribbean to become more resilient. We had taken the decision after Tropical Storm Erica in 2015 that destroyed 90% of GDP to create our own resilience fund. Before that could be capitalized, we had Hurricane Maria. We have to deal with the effects of Hurricane Maria. So it is not possible for us on our own to have that resilience fund. And therefore, we have to look at this on a regional basis. And we need to have, particularly the countries that contribute most to climate change, help us with that resilience fund. Capitalize it so that we can begin to do the corrective measures that are necessary for us to build the resilience that is required so that our economies can survive. Because we are facing an existential threat from climate change. And if we do not get the support that we require, we are facing dire consequences along the way, because this climate change is with us. We expect that we will get more frequent storms, powerful storms as we did in 2017, and we need to be able to mitigate and adapt to that new reality that we're facing. Just to add to that, you asked specifically what are governments doing. I've indicated some of them, and also the need for us to have that national resilience plan, but importantly, for the finances to be made available to effect what is in the plan.
Thank you very much, Minister Barron. Minister Cattle, I would like to tap into your experience of having been a member of the Caribbean Development Bank.
Oh dear.
So both Prime Minister Chastanet and Minister Barron talked about that issue of funding, source of funds, access to funding, and perhaps we can even put in the issue of concessionary funding, because those are the things that will help us, because as Minister Barron said, before they could even capitalize the fund, they were hit by another hurricane. Perhaps we could get your take on what we need to do as a region to deal with that issue of access to funding, source of funds. How can we work together to deal with that kind of issue?
Well, you mentioned institutions earlier, and I think that we need to strengthen the ones that we have. We have been advocating for some time with the bank to increase its presence and its activity with respect to funds like the Green Climate Fund. We think that there's a lot of advocacy to be done in terms of the kinds of instruments and financing mechanisms available, the time it takes for projects to be finalized and to be able to access those resources, the overemphasis on adaptation and mitigation as against total loss through disaster, and being able to build resilience for total loss. Because you'll find that entities like GCF and others, they are looking more at, well, what can you do to address emissions and these kinds of things. And really, what we're dealing with in small and developing states is really about total loss of property, of livelihoods, of future. And you will find that the global financial architecture is not really prepared or has not oriented itself yet to that question. So I think that we have opportunities through the CDB and other of our regional organizations to be able to really make concrete what it is that we're asking for in that global space. All three of us on the panel have talked about the need for a fund, a resilience fund that's capitalized by the polluters. That is certainly one area of advocacy that the bank and other institutions can take up. But I think that for us, there's some practical questions about what does that financing look like, and what does it allow us to do, and how do we get creative? There are two things that I think we have to confront here in terms of how we build resilience and how we're able to finance for resilience building. One is diversification and the need to make sure that we develop the kinds of economies that can recover quickly. Because a lot of the loss is continuing and ongoing loss from not being able to get back up once we have had a disaster or a climate event. Because remember, resilience is not about the event not occurring or not hitting us. It's really about our capacity to withstand and recover. And I think the question about how are we structuring our economies to be able to respond to that. The other, I think, is the question of inequality. And the poor, as we know, are much less able and capable at the individual and the household and community level to make themselves resilient. And you will find a real difference in the impact of an extreme weather event in a country with high levels of poverty and inequality as opposed to other countries that don't have such high levels of inequality. So what we need to do is address inequality with respect to people's capacity to be resilient. So for example, one of the things that we're looking at in Barbados, we've framed the project as the Roofs to Reefs program. And it really looks at the entire circular system from the resilience of homes and of roofs. The situation in Barbados is that after Hurricane Jeanette, we had the advent of these storm carpenters who just came in and very quickly built this kind of roof that would, they put it on quickly, but it can't really withstand anything. And so across the island, we have all these roofs that really can barely withstand a high wind. And there is a relationship between the resilience of the household structure and the water and sanitation, other infrastructure there, how those outflows also interact with the natural environment. So you have a household that is not really capable or not really equipped to interact in a healthy way when it comes to water and sanitation with the rest of the environment. And so we have issues with outflow into the marine environment, issues with drainage, and how waste that is generated from the household affects drainage and the resilience of our drainage systems, how it affects coral reefs. And so what we've tried to do is to frame an entire program that says, look, we are not just talking about resilience at the macro level. We have to start at the household level, and we have to develop financial instruments for individual households and companies and firms to be able to be a part of our overall approach to resilience. So we signed a $27 million grant with the GCF to be able to look at how we make resources available to individuals and companies to, for example, have water-saving devices, to be able to retrofit their homes, to be resilient to extreme weather events. And of course, we're not just talking about a single severe event, but we're talking about extreme high rainfall events and so on. And that project includes a revolving adaptation fund, because we think that is important to find sources of finance that are not just about what government executes at the macro level, but about what people are able to do. And you'll find that the effect of that is that it shows people that they also have some agency in being a part of this resilience issue. So I think that that we have to get creative about the financing options that are available to governments to execute, but also available to people. Barbados is in an adjustment program. And as we move from recovery to transformation, we are not in the position of coming up with traditionally structured financing options, because we do have debt ceilings and we do have constraints with respect to our budget and our capital expenditure. And so we are in the position of having to get very creative with how we frame our development priorities. Really, quite a lot of what we put forward has a climate argument. Almost everything that we do really, especially if it's about infrastructure, roads. We have the Scotland district that's very prone to slippage. there is a climate argument. There is a case to be made that this is really about livelihoods and about being able to continue to exist in the future. And I think being able to frame our development argument in that way and having the support of the institutions of CARICOM and our regional institutions like CDB to help advocate and to frame that development argument in a new way is really how we can change the conversation.
Thank you very much. There are two areas that I just wanted to ask to our panelists before I open the floor for questions. And in the vulnerability index that was presented by Mr. Cotton, we saw that there were quadrants. And one of those quadrants is the social dimension. And it has been said that crime and criminal activity, violent crime, is the soft underbelly of what could be quite destructive in our small countries. Social issues play a major role in the area of vulnerability. And I wanted to put to the panel whether that is being considered. And I know violent crime is something that has been occupying governments throughout our region. And I just wanted to bring that aspect of vulnerability into the conversation. And the other thing I wanted to ask is the issue of involving the private sector. Because essentially we have discussed what the government can do, but it is clear that our medium to small enterprises need to be involved in developing our resilience and our larger firms. So I would really like you to address those issues. And instead of asking Prime Minister Chastanet to start, I would ask Minister Barron.
Yeah. Okay. I should say to you that we're looking at resilience from a holistic point of view. And that includes looking at areas of the social sector and other sectors as well. And I think that we have not, we're trying to include all issues in looking at the resilience plan generally. And I must say that we have had very good support from our partners in that regard, in helping us create that structure that will allow for that plan to be developed. The issue of crime in the Caribbean is one that is of concern to all of us, particularly the incident of gun crimes. As we know, we do not manufacture guns in the Caribbean, but they are coming in. And given the porous nature of our borders, it's very difficult to properly patrol the borders and prevent these guns from coming in. But I think what is important is for us to provide this enabling environment to encourage our youth or to direct our youth into the productive path. Part of the whole idea of building economic resilience is to see how we can retool our youth, how we can get our youth more involved and interested in the productive sectors. We spoke earlier about the area of agriculture. For Dominica in particular, agriculture and tourism are our mainstays. The youth generally have not been as interested in agriculture because they think of agriculture in the old way. Mm-hmm. But there's a new way of doing agriculture. And the support is necessary to be given to the youth, to involve them in the new ways of doing agriculture. Show them how it can be done, but also provide them with the support. Many of them do not have land. Many of them do not have access to finance. So these are areas that we have to look at to make the financing available to them, make the land available to them, and sort of hold their hands for a while and show them the potential that there is to be made from agriculture. So that has numerous benefits, not just in improving our food security, but also having our youth involved in more productive engagements. We're also looking at the skills development. We have persons who have not completed primary school, but they have skills. And we have the CVQ system that would allow for there to be a skills certificate issued to them. So one of the things that we're looking at in Dominica is to work with the Dominica State College so that those persons who are engaged in plumbing, in construction activities, and so on, can actually go to the state college in the evenings. They do their work in the day, but they go to the state college in the evenings, and they have the opportunity to get a skills certificate, which makes them more marketable. So we're looking at initiatives such as that to ensure that persons have greater opportunity to engage in productive employment. We also have to look at areas for development of sports, getting our people, and I say particularly, it is a fact that we find that crime is committed more by our younger people who perhaps have too much time on their hands and then perhaps get involved in criminal activity. That we look at sports development, we look at strengthening our education sector as well, and looking at not only your traditional education, but also developing on vocational skills. So it is something that has to be tackled from many different angles so that we can address those issues. But again, we face, I think, within the Caribbean, the challenge of being able to provide all of the services that are required by our people to be able to be successful. And we have to, when we look at the whole question of building resilience, we have to look at ways in which we can do things differently and be able to support endeavors and creativity amongst our young people to get involved in businesses that can be able to give them livelihood support, so that there is not that layer by engaging in criminal activity.
Thank you. Prime Minister.
I'm not so sure I want to take your bait and go down the road and widen the discussion on resilience, because I still don't think that we've completed the discussion on the bigger one. But if I just deal with the social side of it first, are we looking to create a population of substitutes? Meaning, are we going to go out and look for jobs for our young people that we believe they can do cheaper than other people in other countries? So if you look at the apparel industry, even to some extent the ICT center, meaning that you can hire a young person in our country cheaper than you can hire them in another country. Or are we generally going to have a quantum leap and we're going to create a productive sector that can compete on a global basis? So what would be the industry that can generate the greatest amount of added value in our region? We keep saying that we're the most innovative region in the world. Have we created up the infrastructure to make that happen? We created up a system where we can create an incubator for young people to come up with patents and copyrights of ideas. So if you take Estonia as an example, I met some young kids who came up with an idea to develop an electrical scooter. And the advantage of this scooter was that you could fold it. So if you're getting on a bus, you could take your scooter with you, you can take it to work, put it in your locker. So if you're living in a community in which the bus stop is far away from your home, right? Or if you're getting into town and you don't have your own transportation, I can take public transportation to the town, get on my scooter. And they designed to build it, it could go for 25 miles, on a charge. It carried me, so that's pretty impressive. And they built it for $1,500. So they put a patent on it, and they went to China, got a Chinese company to manufacture it for them, created an online website, and are selling it globally. So the advantage of what's happened in Estonia is they think of themselves as a virtual country with no borders. And so the whole world now becomes their border. So if you go back to that measurement I said is output per acre. So imagine having a building with about 500 young kids of lawyers, engineers, IT designers, marketing people, finance people, who are now adding value to building businesses through sweat equity, in which they're getting shares in the business. Because with the small businesses are like laying eggs for a turtle. Right? You got to lay 100 in order to hope that 1 or 2 live. Small businesses are the same thing. You have no idea which one's going to succeed, so you got to turn them out as fast as possible. Right? So where are these industries that are going to help us now to add value, to take advantage of the fact that we should have the best education system in the world, given our size? But there's a word that unfortunately cripples our region. It's called mediocrity. We talk about excellence, but do we live it every day? You know, so part of this resilience building is about being much more ambitious. I mean, Usain Bolt, what I love about him is not him. What I love about him is that his coach in high school was his coach as a professional. So imagine that Jamaica had produced a quality coach at high school level that could take an athlete to the international level and make him a legend. So are we investing in our teachers? Are we investing in our investment bankers? Are we creating systems that we're adding value to help our population to become so much more productive? And I just think that we're just not ambitious enough in terms of what we're trying to be able to do. And the fact is that the sense of urgency that we need is not there. We're being left behind. Now, the physical resilience, if we don't resolve it in the next 3 years, we're not going to have a chance to give our young people that opportunity. And that's why it has to be singularly the most important thing that we try to solve within the next year or 2 years. But we don't have much more time, because as Francine said, hurricane season's every year. We don't know when the next one is going to hit. And when it hits, it sets you back even further from being able to achieve what. So the idea of being a zone of excellence, of creating innovation, the monies that you need to put into your education system, to put into the internet infrastructure to allow you to be able to compete on a global basis, those things are not going to happen because of the monies you're now having to spend on fixing up lost capital. So this is why we're saying, if I have to invest in a bridge that goes higher, it doesn't carry any more cars. When I invest in putting my utility wires underground, it doesn't make the electricity to the phone calls go any faster. So this is sunk cost that's going in. So we're now faced with the dilemma that the world cannot change. Even confronted with the truth, even confronted with the humanitarian disaster that's before us, they still can't change. Not one institution has been able to say, emergency meeting, the processes we have are not working, and therefore we have to change it. So to facilitate it, what we think we might need to do is create our own Bill Clinton Foundation. So let's call it the Resilience Foundation for SIDS. That we create a governance structure that all of the ODAs and everybody are happy with. And can we make that foundation into an SPV in which the debt is carried by the SPV? And that the ODAs now have the ability of maybe not putting all the money through CDB, because I would like it for CDB to push back. I would love CDB to say to all the ODAs, gentlemen, what we're doing can't work. Rather than receive money and adopt now the protocols that are being established by the ODAs. Because if the ODAs genuinely believe what CDB is doing is good and they have the capacity, then allow them to build a protocol system that is suitable to our region. There's got to be better ways in which we're going to have trust with each other. Because the current system is not working. This is really a corps of engineers. A corps of engineers can go throughout the OECS in less than 6 months, I guarantee you, and identify pretty much every major infrastructural project that needs to be done. Those engineers, or combined with local engineers, in less than 3 months can tell you how much that's going to cost. Put out a process where you put out a bid really fast because it's an emergency to get a company to help now execute that work program. But where is that sense of urgency? Where is that humanitarian recognition of what we're being confronted with? And that's my difficulty. And us as a region, we're allowing ourselves to be boxed in between European blacklists that have absolutely no basis. And we all know that. There's no report that can show that this region is any riskier than anywhere else in the world. In fact, the reports will show that we're least riskier. But nobody says anything. And then we say to ourselves, well, how come the Caribbean is not doing this? And why is the Caribbean not doing that? But we've got to be able to push back. We've got to take control of our own destiny. And I'm hoping that when we go to the UN meeting, Prince Andrew's kindly assisted to use his office to invite the SIDS to come to a meeting, to adopt the idea of having a foundation, a SID Foundation for Resilience. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to convince the ODAs to put money in them. The UAE has said they'll be the first to put money into this entity in order to allow us now to fund the physical resilience programs that we need to get. Because if we don't do that part, all the other things that we're talking about are going to be to naught. I can assure you. Because a couple of more disasters and we're not ready, we're done. In Dominica, Francine is not even telling you the frustration of a business person, builds a hotel, gets hit by the hurricane, can't get back 100% of the money they put in, fights with the insurance company, maybe they're lucky to get 60 cents on the dollar. To rebuild that same hotel that cost him $1 before, he's now going to have to spend $1 or $1.75. And after all of that, the insurance company is telling him, oh, by the way, now your insurance premium is going to go up 200%. So how do you run a small business in which your insurance premium is 25% of your operating cost? It just can't be done. Now, everybody in this room is intelligent enough to know that. There's no lies. These are verifiable facts. And yet, it's 2 years?
Mm-hmm. Almost.
2 years. You know, it's like when I went to my first IMF meeting. And I sat there, and the first thing we did was to apologize to Haiti because of the hurricane that happened in 2016. As if none of us knew at some point the 300,000 people that were left homeless after the hurricane in 2010, at some point in the future would be confronted by a Category 5 hurricane. How would you like to be living in a cardboard box facing a Category 5 hurricane? And the response is, I'm so sorry, my sympathies. We have to do much better than that. And we in the Caribbean are failing to give a compelling case as to why we need help. And we can't accept what's taking place. But at the same time, I agree 100%, we have to get our own house in order. We have to take control of the things we can control. The quality of our education system, what industries we choose to get into, how we choose to spend our money, how we run our countries. We cannot continue to run our countries in deficits because there are too many shocks that are coming, too fast and furious. So it means that to make money, you actually have to have a reserve. And so you have to build a system that does that. And how are we going to achieve that? Regionalism. We go to OECS meetings and CARICOM meetings. We've spoken about a security system. By investing in a security system, it's much more cost effective to do it regionally. Have we done it? No. That if we invest in a common education system, is there cost effectiveness in doing that in terms of reducing the cost per citizen and improving the quality? Yes. Have we done it? No. Healthcare. So who do we have to blame?
But, Prime Minister, if I may, well, I hope I'm not going over my remit, but when the prime ministers meet, do you all have these discussions?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You know, because as a region, we really need to do these things, and it is our leaders who have to take us, or at least encourage or develop the framework that would allow for these things to happen. Because sometimes we go out on our own as individual islands in the Caribbean region and don't work together to make sure that when our voice is heard, you're hearing all the voices saying one thing. So I'm not a panelist, I'm just the moderator. But I just wanted to ask that. But what I'll do now, if you don't mind, I think I'll open the floor for questions. I look at Minister Cadell, and she looks as though she will take the first question. Is there a mic?
Want some water?
But also for the initial presentation that was made. There were 3 areas of vulnerability stroke resilience that were looked at: economic, social, and environmental. Where in that model is dispute management or dispute settlement vulnerability? And I say it in this context. The problem now that we have between Guyana and Venezuela came out of an arbitration decision in the 1880s. Ask Belize what happened as a result of that Bank of Belize decision against the Lord Ashcroft entities and how that has impacted them. Think of Guyana having found lots of oil and lots of gas, and what could happen in an investor-state dispute coming out of something like that. And to think it is fanciful, it is not. The UCAS arbitration in 2015 had a claim of $113 billion, an award of $50 billion. Think of Guyana with all its oil, finding itself in a position like that. How vulnerable would they be? And how is the region being prepared to deal with those questions? As lawyers, we know that a lot of companies go insolvent, not necessarily for lack of financial resources, but for lack of adequate legal protection and issues relating to dispute management. And the list could go on and on and on. And unfortunately, we seem not to, when we're thinking economics and things related to that, to bear in mind that all of that has a legal foundation based on a series of interconnected contracts, all giving rise to possibility of disputes. So when we're hearing nothing, looking at trade and disputes relating to trade and investment, then I'm saying that we're not thinking seriously, because it is a fact in the private sector that many companies go under because they simply cannot manage their disputes. And the same thing is happening. And as a region, I can assure you that all that has to happen is for there to be an adverse finding in one of those investor-state disputes, and we're under. Importantly, in that context, there is currently reform happening.
I don't mean to stop your flow.
Yes.
But could I ask you to develop that into a question so that
I will after making this one point, because I think it's important.
Thank you.
The other thing I need to bear in mind here is that the investor-state dispute settlement system is being currently reformed. There was a regional meeting in Domrep a couple of months ago. There were 2 countries in the region represented, Belize and Jamaica. I was there, so I can speak to it. And we seem not to be involved in something which has this sort of implication. So the question for the panel, the Prime Minister in particular, I know St. Lucia was not represented, is what are we doing to ensure that dispute management vulnerability and all the things related to it is properly brought into the mix of how we prepare to go forward, understanding the implications.
Thank you. Prime Minister?
I think that's just broadening this discussion way too much. I mean, so I'm happy to have that discussion with you off the stage. But I mean, when we start talking about resilience, we can broaden this thing as wide as you want it to be, as you have. I mean, to me, what we're really here to talk about is the resilience of climate change, which is really predominantly at this point physical and has major financial implications to us as national debt. I agree with you, and I can pick on a lot of different things to talk about the vulnerability. You just asked what happens at CARICOM meetings. That would go a long way, but we're here to talk about the physical vulnerability and how we're going to be able to resolve that, because that's the exogenous threat we have. Because if in fact we don't have airports operating, if people are losing confidence in investing in our countries, so if we don't solve the problem, and the cost of investing in countries now becomes so prohibitive that we can't get FDI investments again, we have a problem. So we've got to resolve this issue now, because we're not in control of our own destiny. We are not creating the problem. We can't, through mitigation, meaning changing our way of life, affect or change what's going to happen to us. So we have to accept that we have this climate change problem, and then we're further being handicapped or stymied by all of these national protocols that are in place that are unfair. How can debt to GDP recognize the problem that we're in? I mean, we all understand that, but how come it's taking so long? And the problem is, we keep saying this, the clock is ticking. And I want you to put yourself in the perspective of a cardboard box in Haiti knowing a Category 5 hurricane is coming. That's what we are. We're living in that cardboard box. And Dominica and St. Martin and the BVI are examples in our backyard as to what that impact is. And as Francine said, if it wasn't for the CIP funds, nothing would have changed. So at least some people are better off, and they're giving the country some level of hope. But the system that we have is not working. And I'm really begging the development agencies and the countries, the developed countries in this room, to genuinely understand that. And to also appreciate we're not moving fast enough. And so if you needed justification, let's go back 10 years. And the solution to this problem, remember this, it was like, the old term, we were going to have a carbon bank. Remember how the carbon bank was going to work? That people who were producing carbon emissions, right, would buy clean space from us. And that's how the swap would happen. But it's on the principle that somebody's producing an output, okay, and there's a consequence to everybody else. So there needs to be that acceptance. And therefore, we need a more timely and effective way to do it. Creating this foundation that I'm talking about is just a vehicle to maybe help facilitate it. Because the idea of going back to many of your countries and changing the protocol to suit our need may be just too impossible to think of. I mean, there was a head of a development agency that looked me straight in the eye and said, Prime Minister, I can't make the adaptation. Because if I did that, there's a whole bunch of other regions in the world that would also want an exception to the rule. So I'm just saying, for the SIDS, for us, in absolute terms, it's not a big number. Just allow us to take control of our own destiny. Give us one less thing. We still have to fix all the other vulnerabilities we have. That's our responsibility to do. I get that. And that's why I don't want to have a long talk about those things, because that's our responsibility. But this issue with physical resilience, we don't have the capacity under the current regimes to solve our problem. And we genuinely need your assistance now.
Thank you.
If I could perhaps
Certainly.
offer a perspective on the question, because I understand that time is an issue, and I understand that issues of physical resilience are critical, because if we are not standing, then we can't do anything. But I also understand that every day, people in the Caribbean get up and leave their homes and go and fulfill functions in the state and in the private sector to keep our countries running. And the question is, what are the opportunities that we have now every day when we get up in our own governance systems and the way that we function that can add value to what we're doing? And I think the question was a bit outside the scope, but it did speak to, and I think the index included something about doing business and having that being a part of the economic resilience and how we measure that. Because one of the things that we found, certainly in Barbados, is that if you're talking about reducing inequality as an input for improving resilience, that you really have to give people more agency in what's happening. And so you have to be able to create systems and an environment where regular people can be included in your growth. And you spoke earlier, Prime Minister, about what are the industries that are going to help us maximize our potential. But I think that we've been looking at it in a bit of a different way, which is that what is the environment that is going to encourage people to create economic opportunities that are going to lead to a high-wage, high-skilled economy? Because you're right, that we don't want to start creating low-wage jobs just to get young people off the streets. But the question is, what are the opportunities that can be created by the powers of government that are not about tax and spend, the powers of government that are about regulation and legislation and the things that we can do to create that environment? And so, I hate to kind of get back on the ground to the practical things that we've been doing, but I think it's important to be able to point to opportunities that we have every day. We've been doing a lot of work with respect to the doing business environment, and I raise it because the capacity to resolve disputes is one of the things that is measured there, and it's one of the very important things, because a company's not going to come in if they feel that when they have an issue with their investment, that their money is going to be trapped in the system and nothing is going to happen. And so we've been doing a lot of work on the doing business environment. I think that that's a very important part of building the kind of resilience that shifts the question of equality, and that really provides opportunity, because when people have more income, when people are better off, they're in a better position to make their lives and their livelihoods climate proof. And so, for example, we've done a lot of work on the Town and Country Planning, what we now call the Planning and Development Act, which makes it easier for people to get a permit, which is another one of the indicators of doing business. We've done a lot of work to look at our corporate registry and really what are the things that we can do to give people access to finance, to new financial instruments, that they can really be a part of it. A big part of that is our new model of economic enfranchisement. Our growth and development model for Barbados and our resilience model is about economic enfranchisement. And how do we use those services that government provides every day, like sanitation and garbage collection, like transport, to involve people so that they're no longer on the margins of development, but that they can own shares in a company, own one of the electric buses that is going to be providing the service. I mean, these are real questions, and these are real things that I think we can do every day to make sure that all of those quadrants of resilience are covered. And so I think it's still a conversation that we have to have. I think the advocacy is important. I think that using whatever regional leverage, whatever leverage we have as a bloc, making sure that our commitment to the Caribbean single market and economy is not just lip service, making sure that in the context of that, of CARICOM, we look at the RSS, we look at how we're really leveraging each country's comparative advantage to be able to create single systems for a lot of what plague us. I think those conversations are important, but I think it's also important to be able to use the opportunities that we have every day while we do that to change the conversation on our economic model, to get back to the idea of economic enfranchisement, so that we're not just creating, we're not just giving people incomes every day, but that we're creating intergenerational wealth, so that our countries really do become resilient in ways that matter for future generations.
Thank you. I think we have another question. I just want us to, yes, to remember that the document that Mr. Cotton put forward to us talked about multidimensional vulnerability and consequently multidimensional resilience. So it's not only climate change, it's also what's happening with our economies, it's also what's happening socially. It's multidimensional, and that is what we need to bear in mind when we talk about moving from vulnerability to resilience and then to transformation, because it's not just one issue, it's a variety of issues, and so our thinking must be along those lines. Yes.
Good afternoon, Jessica Byron, Institute of International Relations, UWI. I wanted to ask two questions. The first comes out of a comment by the Prime Minister from St. Lucia. I'm sure it was not meant this way, but you spoke about the limitations of land and the potential for growth. The Pacific Islands look very much to the ocean in terms of their assets that can increase growth, which brings us to the blue economy. Now, for us, the sea can often be a threat in terms of climate change, but it is also a tremendous ocean of opportunity for economic growth if we really start exploring blue economy opportunities for new industries, for new forms of economic activity. And I was wondering to what extent we are really contemplating those possibilities as small islands surrounded by a lot of marine resources. That's the first thing. Now, on the other side of the coin, Minister Barron was speaking about the resilience plan. And these are things that are very important for all of us to be looking at, because it can happen to any country in the Caribbean. I was wondering to what extent, for areas that are extremely vulnerable, or sectors such as our coastal tourism, does the question of relocation for certain very vulnerable residential areas or sectors, is that a part of the resilience plan that you're building? So those were my two main questions.
Thank you very much.
Now you go first.
Okay. The simple answer to your question in relation to the resilience plan is yes. As part of the whole idea of building resilience, one has to take into account your natural vulnerabilities. And so we have looked at the areas in which communities are located, and there are certain communities that have to be relocated. And I should say to you, the 2015 storm Erica destroyed 2 communities, and we have had to relocate both those communities to safer areas. So we've developed a new community for the persons who were dislocated from those vulnerable areas. And in creating that new community, we have inculcated the whole idea of resilience. So we have built with concrete roofs, we have put we've undergrounded the utility lines. Those communities were in the process of being built when Hurricane Maria hit, and we found that they withstood Hurricane Maria very well. So we think that it is something that can work. It is working, and it means that if that community is affected by a hurricane and the electricity lines are down, we can just bring a generator to that area and we can hook up the utility lines which are underground, and they will be able to function. We have also done water tanks for that area, so they will have a continuous supply of water. And we have identified other areas of the country where people are living in very vulnerable situations, and that is part of the relocation that will take place under the new housing program that we have as part of our whole resilience building infrastructure. The answer to your question is yes, there are communities that will have to be relocated. And also, we are looking at reviewing our building standards, our planning requirements, so that people will not build in vulnerable areas. In the past, you've had people building too close to rivers, and they've been the subject of flooding. So all of that has to be looked at so that we can reduce on our vulnerabilities in those areas.
Thank you.
So before I answer your question with regards to the blue economy, let me just say this, that I could come here and talk about what St. Lucia is doing. Right? So we've been very successful. We've put on additional taxes in order to accept the reality that we have to fix up our country. So we're probably going to be spending the most amount of capital investment than we have in the history of my country. New roads, water, and all to resilience codes. We've been able to grow our economy the last 3 years. We've substantially impacted on our debt to GDP. So we've been doing that and declining the debt to GDP, reduced the unemployment, and done a whole bunch of things. But here's what the reality is, that St. Lucia can't survive in the Caribbean by itself. So I'm here speaking as a regional person, understanding that the cruise industry was severely damaged because Puerto Rico was out, the US Virgin Islands were out, St. Martin was out, Dominica was out. And a cruise ship can't come to Barbados and St. Lucia by itself. Trinidad's greatest trade surplus is with whom? Was with us in the OACS and the other Caribbean countries. So if all of a sudden the economies go underwater in our region, it's going to have a severe impact. So where do we want to stop the vulnerability from? We're all tied. Now, St. Lucia has found that because we had the fiscal space to be able to do those things by ourselves, but I'm here to fight for my neighbors that don't. And that we have to have a collective voice in being able to change this. And the blue economy is the same thing. You know, my 500-mile economic zone is restricted because of where my borders are, but the amount of money that we're going to have to spend to determine where those opportunities lie is going to require all of us to go together, because 170,000 people by itself is not going to be, unless you're going to be doing mining of oil in the waters, you know, and then we bring the international expertise in, then we get a residual on whatever that amount's going to be. So it's our negotiation skills in terms of being able to take advantage of what those opportunities are. So we don't know what those full resources are. Are we going to fish together and are we protecting our 500-mile economic zones? You know, we have a lot of industries. We have ships going on our waters. Are we going to sit down and collectively negotiate as a region? So I agree with you, but the fact is that I'm not even taking advantage of my land yet. I'm not even coming close to achieving full potential on what I can produce. St. Lucia is the same physical size as Singapore. Think of it, 238 square miles. I have a population of 170,000. They have a living population of 4 million, and they have a daily population of 6 million. 2 million people come in and out on a daily basis. Look what they're doing with 238 square miles, right? So, but I think that we've got to be more ambitious. We've got to recognize what's our potential, measure our success against that, understand that given the size that we are, that we have to add higher value, which means that we have to have a better education system, to your point, in terms of creating a population that can take advantage of these opportunities. And physically, be able to have an internet system, have a legal system, rule of law, that recognizes the rights that we have, because the greatest added value is in that creativity. You know, we talked about the steel pan, talked about music, right? We had Bob Marley, who in the 70s dominated the world. Have we created a system here now to take young musicians, create an incubator system for them, that before they sign up with a major company, that they've already established themselves? Have we taught them how to negotiate? and to write a contract. But yet here we have these incredible success stories that we have this talent. And this is what I'm saying, is that we got to fix those things ourselves. So the vulnerability to me and resilience that we're talking about, the vulnerability is competitiveness. It's not about just building, it's build competitiveness. The resilience I'm speaking of is the one that we don't have control over, is that physical resilience. It's outside of our control. Some of us may have the capacity over a long period of time to apply monies on a short-term basis to continue building that physical resilience. But if we have to resolve the problem now, dealing with the fact that the hurricane season is next year, the amount of capital that we would have to invest, the cost of that capital, and what alternatives I could have used that money for, those two numbers don't add up. And that's where we need the help.
Thank you. Another question.
Afternoon, Josanne Leonard, Trinidad and Tobago. Prime Minister Chastney, you're just in the hot seat by two. It's Eid Mubarak. So I would say I choose my poison, I choose my sir wine today, and Eid Mubarak to everyone in the room, Muslim brothers and sisters. You very, very strong advocacy, where I want to get a sense, and Minister Regis touched on it a little bit, about what's happening at the level of leadership, maybe amongst the prime ministers and the various forums that we have in CARICOM. And because I said I'm choosing my sir wine selectively today, I will just focus on the fact that you've been talking about a lot about the physical resilience. And you mentioned this issue of going to create a new fund. In the room, we have the Caribbean Development Bank, and we have donor partners, and we have other institutions. The nuance, I think, as a Caribbean citizen, I feel, is that I feel that oftentimes we represent ourselves as mendicants, that we're not in control, you've used that word, and that others are dictating our agenda a lot of the times. So in your view, and certainly Prime Minister Motley articulated it when she sat at the Clinton Global Initiative in Puerto Rico recently, where the very metrics and indices that are outlined by the international institutions don't necessarily work in our favor. So the question as a sitting Prime Minister, and then everyone else and the panel is a member of a government in the region, what are we doing to better represent ourselves, or how can we better represent ourselves? And in that process, how do we bring along Caribbean people? Because in this room are lots of suits and very well couteured, dress. But when we leave here, how is this really impacting the average citizen in the region who you have to face in your 5-year cycle, which oftentimes predetermines what governments do or don't do, because it may not be the kind of thing that they've been able to bring the people to the table with. So I mean, maybe it's not a very specific question, but the idea of this fund that you mentioned, Prime Minister, why do we have to go outside to maybe have somebody else be the sort of benefactor? All kudos to Richard Branson and the Climate Change Accelerator Program or the Bill Clinton Initiative. But what do we as Caribbean people do or should be doing? And with a Prime Minister like yourself, who's very, very passionate about it, and with the institutions like the CDB and others, why are we waiting to tick someone else's boxes and not dictating an agenda? And I'm just focusing on the physical resilience thing that you have so greatly championed here this evening. And I'm not poo-pooing everything else that has come up from Minister Cadell and the others on the panel. What is the takeaway today from this room, the Caribbean Development Bank and other institutions, in terms of us setting a regional agenda, sticking to it, and getting Caribbean people, including the private sector, involved in that kind of program? Maybe it's too broad.
I'm going to be very fast. From day one, we as a group of leaders have been on the same page with this issue. We went up to the UN meeting in September in 2017, right? Everybody spoke at the UN, said the same thing. Everybody met in the hallway, we spoke the same thing. A slight breakthrough was the UK government could not use ODA funds to help the BVI, right? So when we met Boris and Priti Patel, and we had a meeting with them, we started explaining to them what the problems were. They went and they pounded their fist on the table with the OECD, got a slight adjustment, and were able to use some of their ODA funds for the BVI. And so it started the discussion or the dialogue with the OECD, who my understanding is are currently doing a study to determine whether in fact that they're going to allow the SIDS to be classified differently only for resilience. So I'm going to tell you, the daily economic stuff that we're doing, continue to classify me by your per capita GDP, hold me to that standard, but on resilience building, use the vulnerability index to at least allow me to access concessionary funds. Because many of us, because we're middle income countries, are denied that. We cannot wait for COP. We've made that point. We've been to the COP meetings. I call it the 5-minute speech. You get to go and speak for 5 minutes, everybody applauds, you get to take a little picture afterwards, and there's no follow-up, right? So I have no interest in going to COP. Okay, so it's great to send my students there. It's a great university training lab, but in terms of actual advocacy and getting anything done, we've had nothing. There was, through pressure, the UN agreed to do a fundraising, a donor agency stuff. We've been through that. All people do is they come there and take existing money, reclassify it, rebrand it, and put it back into a pool and tell you that this is specifically to deal with the resilience. And we don't know when the money shows up, okay? We then had, because Mia and myself, pounded. So if you think I'm pounding today, today is mild. Pounded that eventually now the World Bank and IDB and there was one more, and the IMF agreed to have a meeting in November, which they promised me that it would not be one of these 5-minute dialogue meetings. We spent the entire day with the technical staff. Studies were done with St. Lucia to show how much money we would have to set aside, i.e. 0.7% or 0.8% of our GDP for a 12-year period, and that the analysis showed that if we did that, that we couldn't afford to do it. So the only way that the money we could survive is the money would have to be considered by grant. Okay? We talked about the new normal. And we left that meeting with a thud, because the realization of what I'm saying here today, every technical person in that room agreed. But the problem is nobody knows how to change it. So I'm not sitting here waiting. So if in fact the problem is that each agency has its own governance structures and protocols, and if CDB unfortunately is not able to push back, I'm not saying they don't want to, but not able to push back, and has to accept the conditions of the monies that are coming in, then that's not a solution to the problem. I agree with you about the Bill Clinton Foundation and my good friend Mr. Branson. I've been through that. I have no confidence in any of those things taking place. So that's why we said, let's create our own foundation. So if those foundations work, so the foundation basically allows you to set up a governance structure that's outside of any individual country's control, and we can now get the ODAs to agree to put money specifically in that entity, which is completely transparent, that can be used specifically for resilience building for the SIDS, then we're off on our way. So this is what it's about. So if you've seen me not deviate, it's because over the last 3 years, I've learned not to allow myself to be deviated. And I can assure you that most of the heads of government in CARICOM, we're single-minded on this issue. We all know how to advocate. Wherever meeting we have to show up, we're there. We put in the time. And in terms of the general public, I think the general public accepts the fact that these hurricanes are a problem. I don't think they understand the magnitude of what we're confronting to solve the problem. I don't think they understand the urgency and the vulnerability that we have if we don't solve this problem. But I think that all of us, particularly the ministers of finance, absolutely understand that this is problem number one. This makes all the other problems pale in comparison. And the reason is because we're not in control of our own destiny. So the only thing that we can control is to advocate to allow for the SIDS to be able to have this space, to be able to survive. And we're trying our best to do it in a way in which it's easy for everybody to do. But there has to be some level of adjustment. So if the Bill Clinton Foundation can get monies from ODAs and sovereign funds to be able to do similar types of things, then to your point, why can't we create our own foundation, right? And the fact is the issues of the SIDS, whether they're in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, are, for most instances, 80% of them common. If in fact that now starts working, the idea is now to create a global forum for SIDS. Because we're saying that being small has its advantages. And so therefore, a lot of things that we're trying to do in the economic development world can be first started in these smaller states, because it's so much easier to see what the results are. I was having a discussion today with some of the people from the World Bank, and I was saying that you can't start macro with these small states, because the choices we have of the things that we can do are limited. So it means you must understand where those opportunities for growth are, what are those industries, and therefore your macro policy must support that. And as I was explaining to them, there may be industries in which I don't have a comparative advantage in the world, but it's the industry that offers me the greatest opportunity to grow. And so therefore, I'm going to have to create the environment to allow it to become more competitive. And therefore, my macro policies have to support what that is. And so I think there's a lot we can share with each other to be able to move in this very, very difficult world, who are extremely distracted by a lot of other issues. Mm-hmm. But to your point, it's by repetition. Every prime minister wears that hat. Every meeting we go to, we say the same thing. And it's that repetition. So if you hear the repetition today, it's just to make sure that we're getting that message across, that this is a critical issue for us.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I will not entertain any more questions, unfortunately, but I'd like to ask Minister Barron and Minister Cadell to give their closing remarks. Prime Minister, would you want to say anything further? Would you want to repeat?
If you think it's going to work, I'll be happy to. Please.
Minister Barron.
Thank you. I just want to say very simply that from vulnerability to resilience is not a choice. It is a reality. Mm-hmm. We have no choice but to inculcate resilience into everything that we do now. As the Prime Minister has indicated, the challenge we have is to get the financing that is necessary for us to build that resilience. It's something that we cannot do on our own. It is just simply too expensive. And there is a responsibility by those who have created or exacerbated the situation to help those of us who have to deal with the impact of climate change. And therefore, we have to continue to advocate for the creation of this resilience fund, creation of instruments that will allow us to build the resilience that is necessary so that we can survive. And therefore, we have to continue to work towards that end. We don't have a choice. It's something that in fact, if we want to survive, we must do. All of us are required to create that resilience plan. We have, thankfully, from the CDB, an insight from them, and in respect of 4 different areas that one can look at. I think our resilience plan goes a little broader than that. But those are the sort of things that we have to do, look at practical ways in which we can address this issue of resilience. And of course, the financing is going to be critical for that. So I would just like to say that I'm very pleased that CDB has organized this discussion. I think it's something that we have to continue to talk about, but not just talk about for talking's sake, but to look at practical ways in which we can come up with solutions and a way forward for building that resilience that we need for the Caribbean. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Just to close and say that as a woman, perhaps I understand what it means to be able to walk and chew gum, to be able to multitask and have several issues and approaches in the air. I say that to say that the three panelists here, and I would say the four of us, are on the same page in terms of getting away from what I call a credit union approach to our own survival. We cannot, as the victims of climate change, be the ones and the only ones that are asked to contribute to investment in our own resilience. That is clear. The advocacy at the leadership level in the region is necessary, is important. The repetition is key. So let me say that is something with which we're all on board. Further to that, the importance of getting back to regionalism, getting back to what we can achieve as CARICOM and as our various subregions. Those things are extremely important. And I mean, Barbados having lead responsibility for the Caribbean single market and economy, we have in the last year certainly scaled up the efforts. In fact, even in terms of private sector engagement, I'm realizing that we do need a regional private sector body. And we've taken the decision to institutionalize that recently convened body as an associate institution of CARICOM, because we realize that we need that voice at the table as well on regional matters, and we cannot just be states talking to ourselves. So the advocacy at the global level, changes in the global financial architecture, and the understanding and the balance of power, those things are critical. I also think that we have to take advantage in our countries and in our nations of where we find ourselves. Barbados, you know, they say that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so we are at the point of having to really take transformation seriously. We have no choice. So when I talk about climate-proofing the economy, when I talk about diversification being a response, it is something that responds to several things at once. The issue of crime was raised and youth disengagement. But if we really figure out how to, and acknowledge the fact that, you know, we need to remove the issues of logistics and high transportation costs that have been traditionally associated with our economies, and start creating products that don't require us to have them for a week at the port, or have them subject to all of these logistical issues that have plagued us for so long and that we have to figure out. But in the meantime, we need to use these kinds of digital products to be able to create an economy that is not based on sectors that are so susceptible to the issues of climate change. And that is a real issue for Barbados and the region. It is one that we're taking seriously when we look at how to make our economies truly digital. So I think that we have opportunities at all levels, and we have to take them. We have to recognize that we are not just dealing with an existential crisis in terms of our physical presence, but in terms of how we enfranchise our people to be a part of a new regional and global economy. So I think we have to consider and address all issues at once.
Thank you very much. If we have to survive, we must do. We must keep repeating our mantra and work cooperatively and advocate. We cannot be the only ones who are asked to contribute. And I think those are the takeaways that we have to think about and to put forward to our communities as we ensure that if our Caribbean region is to progress, it must be a situation of doing it together. It must be a situation of recognizing that we're all in the same boat, really. And if we don't do it together, we will either sink or swim. And I think we all want to swim. And I also want to say that one of the other takeaways is that our policy makers must face the realities and bring our populations along, let them understand. And in some instances, they probably understand it better than we think. But we must create the enabling environment to ensure that we all move in the same direction. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. I want to pay particular tribute to our Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who exposed himself to us. I want to thank you. Well, I didn't mean it in that way. Right? Right.
Thankfully, it wasn't literally.
But I mean, you know, when you have a prime minister on a panel, a lot of the questions end up being to the prime minister. So Prime Minister, I want to thank you for coming to this panel and for being so passionate about your advocacy. I want to thank Minister Barron, whose advocacy also precedes her, and we heard quite a lot about you before you even got here. And I want to thank you for being so vocal and for being so honest. And I want to also thank Minister Cadell, who has clearly shown that her time with the CDB was not wasted. You are clearly a regionalist, and certainly the government of Barbados is better off with you as a member of the government. So thank you very much for your input. I think Dr. Ram will close us off. And again, thank you very much for being so open and honest.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I think all of the panelists deserve another round of applause. I think this evening we had such a wonderful discussion on a topic that we all know is dear to our heart, and it must keep there. We must keep at it. Repetition, I think, is important. But I think I've heard from the panelists this evening that action now is also required. We also want action from our partners. It's not just us in this. We want action from those who have supported us for many years, but now we're just asking for a little bit more from you. So please, heed our call. I want to say a special thank you to our CDB colleague, Mr. Jason Cotton, for giving us a great presentation on the new multidimensional vulnerability index, which is an attempt by CDB to really step out of the international mainstream to say, hey, we recognize that our countries are special. We are vulnerable in new ways and in old ways. But you know, we've been saying that for a long time. But now we wanted to measure it so that you can see it for yourselves. And this is what we have attempted to do. Again, I want to thank our friend, Minister Cadell, for sharing her wonderful words of advice, wisdom, and experience. And certainly, I agree with our moderator that the government of Barbados is certainly better off with her in the cabinet. Minister Francine Barron, as usual, always great to have you here with us and sharing with us your experience. We thank you so much. Well, Prime Minister Chastine, you are still my friend. Just about. No, you are my friend because you are doing an implementation and delivery unit in your country. But I want to thank you for being so honest and passionate about this particular issue. You have shown that you are a real regional leader. And I want to thank you so much for that. And last by no means least, I have to say a special thank you. So I don't know, I probably have to call her my aunt now. Not my friend anymore. But Minister Camille Robinson-Regis, our governor for this 49th meeting of the Board of Governors meeting, you have been a great inspiration to us at the bank. You have hosted such a wonderful meeting for us. And to agree to, along with all of your busy schedules, to moderate this panel, it's a tremendous service that you have provided us, all of us here in this room and who have attended this meeting. I want to thank you so much for all of your service.